So I have a few moments now in the midst of our Torah portion to share some words of Torah. And so I'm going to begin this morning by asking two questions for you to think about as I share these words this morning. When you hear the word prophet, what does that mean to you? And who are the prophets today in our country, in America? Let's look to our Torah portion this morning, perhaps for some guidance on answering these two questions. If you have a Chumash with you, you can turn to page 1096, and if you don't, you can listen to my words. But in our Torah portion this morning, this is what we read from God, beginning with verse 18 of chapter 18 of the book of Deuteronomy. There it says, I will raise up a prophet for them, this is God speaking, from among their own people like yourself. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will speak to them all that I command him. And if anybody fails to heed the words he speaks in my name, I myself will call him to account. But any prophet who presumes to speak in my name, meaning God's name, an oracle that I did not command him to utter, or speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet shall die. And you shall ask yourselves, how can we know that the oracle was not spoken by the Lord? If the prophet speaks in the name of the Lord and the oracle does not come true, that oracle was not spoken by the Lord. The prophet has uttered it presumptuously. Do not stand in dread of him. From reading these verses, the main concern seems to be, how do you tell who is a Navi Sheker? How do you tell who is a false prophet? How do you distinguish between someone who claims to be a prophet and someone who is a true prophet appointed by God? We saw a similar idea in last week's Torah portion. It seems pretty simple, right? Sometimes we read last week, God will test us by sending false prophets who seem to have supernatural power. And even so, if they say that we should worship idols, then they are liars and God is merely testing us. Now it's even more explicit. The oracle simply won't come true. Now, my friends, this doesn't seem to be as much of an issue today. Fortunately, most of us don't take astrologers or fortune tellers seriously. We can tell pretty quickly someone who really isn't speaking the truth. But how do we identify a true prophet today? We can still look at our history, in our tradition, I think, for some important guidance, because I think there are prophets out there. The prophet in the biblical tradition, in the Jewish tradition, had no power. He or she, they weren't kings or queens. They weren't members of the royal court. They were usually not priests or members of the religious establishment, and they rarely held office. In fact, they were often deeply unpopular. As we were reminded just a few weeks ago on the holiday of Tisha B'Av, the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah, the great prophet that our kids often read the Haftarot from. Who doesn't love Jeremiah? But in his time, he was arrested, flogged, abused by his fellow Jews, put on trial, and narrowly escaped with his life. Why was he so hated? Because he didn't tell the people what they wanted to know or what they wanted to hear. He told people that they were wrong. They weren't doing enough. They needed to change their ways. They were the world's first social critics. The prophets like Jeremiah and others, their message continues through the centuries. Their message wasn't popular then, but perhaps it's extremely popular today. And to paraphrase the great philosopher Kierkegaard, when a king dies, his power ends. But when a true prophet dies, his influence begins. The prophet was distinctive not because he, or I should say she as well, there were 7 great biblical prophetesses. They weren't distinctive because they foretold the future. The ancient world was full of people who claimed to know the forces that govern fate and determine our future. Judaism has no such time for people. I often have to remind people that in Judaism, according to our tradition, the future isn't foretold. We have no idea what the future will be. Because if we did, that means we wouldn't have free will. And that's why the Torah, as we read this morning, bans anyone who practices or interprets omens, practices sorcery, engages in witchcraft, casts spells, or even mediums or spiritists who claim to consult the dead. It disbelieves such practices because it believes in human freedom. The future is not prescripted. The true prophet warns, not predicts, of the future that will happen if we don't heed the danger and mend our ways. Hear the difference. The true prophet warns. The false prophet predicts. Because the future depends on us, the choices you and I make, the choices our society makes. If Israel was faithful to its mission, it would flourish. If it was unfaithful, it would quickly fail. It would suffer defeat and exile. That was Jeremiah's tireless and timeless message. And because of that timeless message, biblically and historically, true prophets spoke out about injustice and exploitation. They spoke on God's behalf when God's people went astray and forgot the downtrodden and the poor. The real prophet doesn't tell us what we want to know, but tells us what God wants us to know, reminding us of our covenantal obligations. The true prophets punched up, not down. They spoke truth to power, not condemnation to the downtrodden and the marginalized. The true prophet, the real prophet, spoke about the unbreakable connection between monotheism and morality. Yes, today in our society, there are people who call themselves prophets, but do they acknowledge poverty, exploitation, or injustice? We often can tell by their fruit, because they have one key message. They say, God's going to enlarge your tent, or expand your influence, or going to give you great favor and bless you mightily. Of course God blesses, and of course God gives people favor at times, and even influence. But these were not the priorities of the biblical prophets. That was not the core of their message. Rather, let me remind you of their messages. Hear from their words. We remember the prophet Amos, who often said words like this, as he says in the 8th chapter of the book of Amos. Hear thus, you who trample the needy and destroy the poor of the land. Isaiah, as our B'nai Mitzvah reminded us today, he would say words like, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, plead the widow's cause. Ezekiel, behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but they didn't aid the poor or the needy. And I love Micah's famous words. You've heard them before. He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. Do we hear these godly messages enough today? Maybe if we heard more people say this, we could identify who are the true prophets in our society. There are two modern-day prophets. Abraham Joshua Heschel, the great rabbi, philosopher of the conservative movement. My favorite story of his is that he was very close with Martin Luther King, and he was invited by MLK to march hand in hand with him with the great civil rights marches. And when he went down to Alabama, he was asked, well, Rabbi, in Alabama in the 1960s, how are you going to find kosher food? Where will you find a synagogue to daven? How will you keep Shabbat? He said that trip, he was praying with his feet. That override the importance of doing rituals. It was important to be there, to set an example, to show what a real prophet does. He was never afraid to move people, even if it was uncomfortable to say. His words and his actions did move generations of people, and he made so many better. We recently lost another prophet in our community. I saw him as a prophet and a rabbi, the great Rabbi Sam Karf, who passed away just a few days ago. The great Rabbi Emeritus of Congregation Beth Israel. He believed that everyone was here for a reason. No matter how difficult life could become, there was a reason you were here. It didn't matter if you were a successful businesswoman or a man living on the street. He saw God in everyone. And even people he didn't like, he still tried to find God in them. I saw it in his words and his actions, in the encounters I was blessed to have with him. He believed all human beings were important, and he pushed his people to act the same way. He created a mighty force in this community. In the mid-'80s, he was on the forefront of helping us in this city during Houston's economic downturn, starting the campaign for the homeless to remind people to champion the causes that were truly important. So I end with two questions as I began this morning with two questions. Who are the prophets in America today? In our politically charged world, can we still even have prophets? I wish we could. And perhaps that would help all of us during this time as we approach, or we are in the midst, really, of this challenging election season. Who are the prophets in America today? And can we still even have prophets? Shabbat Shalom.